In 1983, a fisherman from the port of Moynak took his boat out for the last time. He was on the water all day. He came back in the evening with nothing. The next morning, an official notice arrived. Fishing on the Aral Sea was banned, effective immediately, because there was nothing left to catch. But the sea was still there. A few years later, that too was gone. If you stand in that place today, all you will find is sand, dust, and silence. No water, no waves, no sign of life. Just an endless stretch of dry, cracked earth baking under the Central Asian sun. And then you see them. Ships, massive rusted fishing vessels sitting motionless in the sand. Their hulls corroded, their decks collapsed, their anchors buried in dirt that was once the floor of a sea. These ships did not sink in a storm. They were not destroyed in a war. They are sitting here because the sea they once sailed simply vanished, and no one came to move them. This place is called Moynak. It was once a thriving port city on the shores of the fourth largest sea on Earth. Today, the nearest water is more than 100 miles away. What happened here is not a natural disaster, not an earthquake, not a drought. This is one of the most documented and most devastating man-made environmental catastrophes in recorded human history. A sea the size of Ireland, gone. Not over millions of years, not gradually over centuries, but within a single human lifetime, within 60 years, because of one decision made by men sitting thousands of miles away from these shores. This is the story of the Aral Sea, and this is the story of how humans deliberately killed it. To understand what was lost, you have to go back to a time when the Aral Sea was still alive. Before the 1960s, the Aral Sea was one of the great inland waters of the world. It covered more than 26,000 square miles, an area larger than the state of West Virginia. It sat at the heart of Central Asia, straddling the border between what is now Kazakhstan to the north and Uzbekistan to the south. Two mighty rivers fed it constantly, the Amu Darya from the south and the Sir Darya from the east, carrying snowmelt from the distant mountains of the Himalayas and the Pamir Range, keeping the sea full, keeping it alive. The water was clear, the fish were abundant, and for the people who lived along its shores, the Aral Sea was everything. More than 40,000 people worked in the fishing industry alone. Every morning, fleets of boats pushed out from ports like Moynak and Aralsk, returning in the evening with holds full of carp, bream, pike perch, and sturgeon. In 1957, just the port of Moynak alone landed 48,000 tons of fish in a single year. The Aral Sea was producing 1/6 of the entire Soviet Union's fish supply. 1/6 from a single lake in the middle of a desert. Moynak itself was a city full of energy. It had a cannery that operated around the clock, processing fish that were shipped across the Soviet Union, from Moscow to Siberia. The city had hotels, resorts, and beaches. Soviet citizens came here on vacation to swim in the clear water and eat freshly caught fish by the shore. Children grew up playing at the edge of a sea that seemed like it would be there forever. The ecosystem surrounding the lake was just as extraordinary. The river deltas feeding into the Aral supported over 300 species of birds, dense reed beds, and rich wetlands that stretched for hundreds of miles. The region was, by every measure, a thriving and irreplaceable natural system. Scientists at the time described it as one of the most productive inland water bodies on the planet. Nobody living in Moynak in 1960 could have imagined that within their own lifetime, the sea would be gone. Nobody warned them. Nobody asked them. The decision that would destroy everything they had built was already being made, thousands of miles away, in the corridors of Soviet power. In the early 1950s, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had a vision. He wanted the Soviet Union to become completely self-sufficient in cotton. Cotton was not just a crop to Khrushchev. It was a strategic weapon. The military needed it for uniforms, for equipment, for explosives. The textile industry needed it to clothe hundreds of millions of Soviet citizens. And importing it from foreign countries was, in the eyes of the Kremlin, a sign of weakness. So Khrushchev looked at the map of Central Asia, at its vast desert plains, its warm climate, and its two enormous rivers, and he made a decision that would echo through history. He would turn the desert into cotton fields, all of it. The plan was massive in scale, Soviet engineers designed and built over 30,000 kilometers of irrigation canals, 45 dams, and more than 80 reservoirs, all designed to pull water from the Amu Darya and the Syr Darya rivers and redirect it into the fields. Cotton cultivation expanded from 4.6 million hectares in 1960 to 7 million hectares by 1990. By 1988, Uzbekistan had become the world's largest exporter of cotton. The plan, on paper, was a success, but the canals were built without concrete lining. They were essentially trenches dug through loose desert sand. Experts later estimated that somewhere between 25 and 75% of every drop of water that entered those canals never reached a cotton plant. It evaporated into the air. It soaked into the ground. It vanished before it could do anything useful, and none of it ever reached the Aral Sea again. The two rivers that had sustained the Aral Sea for thousands of years were now being drained dry before they could complete their journey. In the 1950s, the Amu Darya and Syr Darya together delivered around 56 cubic kilometers of fresh water into the Aral Sea every year. By the 1980s, in dry years, that number had dropped to nearly zero. The faucet had been turned off. What makes this story truly disturbing is not just what happened, it is what was known and what was ignored. As early as 1964, a scientist named Alexander Asarin at the Soviet Hydro Project Institute calculated that diverting the rivers at this scale would cause the Aral Sea to disappear. He put it in writing. He submitted his findings. And the response he received from Soviet officials was chilling in its honesty. He was told that the destruction of the Aral Sea was already part of the 5-year plan. It had been approved by the Council of Ministers. It had been signed off by the Politburo itself. And as Asarin later recalled, nobody on a lower level would dare say a single word contradicting those plans, even if it meant the death of the Aral Sea. The sea was not lost by accident. It was sacrificed, deliberately, for cotton. The dying of the Aral Sea did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, year by year, decade by decade, like watching someone take their last breaths in slow motion. In the 1960s, the water level began to drop at an average of about 8 inches per year. To the people living along the shore, it was barely noticeable at first. The shoreline crept back a little. The water looked a little lower, but fishermen were still going out. The canneries were still running. Life continued. Then the 1970s arrived, and the rate of decline nearly tripled. The sea was now losing 20 to 24 inches of water every single year. Ports that had once sat directly on the water began to find themselves hundreds of meters from the shoreline. Fishermen had to drag their boats further and further across wet mud just to reach the water. The catch was getting smaller. The fish were getting harder to find. The salinity of the water was rising as the volume shrank, and many species could not survive the change. By the 1980s, the situation had become catastrophic. The water level was now dropping by 31 to 35 inches every year. The salt concentration had risen so high that most of the native fish species had already died off. Commercial fishing catches had fallen from 43,000 tons per year in 1960 to almost nothing by the late 1970s. And then, in 1983, commercial fishing on the Aral Sea was officially stopped. Not because the fishermen chose to stop, but because there was nothing left to catch. The fishing industry that had employed tens of thousands of people, that had fed a sixth of the Soviet Union, that had sustained entire cities and generations of families, was over. Completely and permanently over. The sea kept shrinking. The mathematics of what was happening were brutal and unforgiving. More water was leaving through evaporation every year than was coming in from the rivers, and the smaller the sea became, the faster it shrank. Shallow water heats up faster under the sun, which means it evaporates faster, which means the sea loses volume faster, which means it gets even shallower. It was a collapse feeding itself. In 1987, the water dropped below a critical threshold. A narrow underwater channel called the Berg Strait, which had connected the northern and southern portions of the sea, went dry. The Aral Sea split into 2 separate bodies of water. The smaller northern section sat inside Kazakhstan. The much larger southern section sat inside Uzbekistan. They would never reconnect. From that point forward, the two halves followed different fates, and the southern half had no fate at all. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the southern Aral continued to shrink and divide. By 2003, the southern section had itself split into eastern and western lobes. The eastern lobe, shallower and more exposed, was disappearing fastest. Scientists watched it via satellite, documenting its retreat year by year, season by season. Then came 2014. That year, NASA satellite images confirmed what scientists had feared for decades. The eastern basin of the southern Aral Sea had completely dried up. For the first time in recorded modern history, that portion of the lake was gone. In its place was a new desert, stretching across more than 15,000 square miles of what had once been open water. Scientists gave it a name. They called it the Aral Sea Desert, making it one of the youngest deserts on Earth, and without question, the most man-made. In less than 60 years, one of the largest lakes on the planet had been reduced to scattered remnants. The sea that had sustained civilizations for centuries had been erased within a single human lifetime. When the sea disappeared, it did not just take the water, it took everything. Muinak, once a proud and busy port city, found itself stranded in the middle of a desert. The shoreline that had once defined the city, the shoreline where fishermen launched their boats every morning and children played in the waves every summer, had retreated more than 100 miles away. The canneries shut down, the shipyards closed, the hotels emptied, the tourists stopped coming. And one by one, the families who had lived there for generations packed what they could carry and left. The fishing industry had employed tens of thousands of people across the entire Aral Sea region. Over the course of 2 decades, as the sea shrank and the fish disappeared, those jobs vanished completely. There was nothing to replace them. There was no other industry. There was no other economy. The people who remained in Muinak and the surrounding towns were left with almost nothing, living in a landscape that no longer resembled the place where they had been born. But unemployment was only the beginning of what the disappearing sea left behind. As the seabed dried out, it exposed decades' worth of accumulated salt, pesticides, fertilizers, and chemical runoff that had been washing into the Aral from the cotton fields for years. The wind picked up that toxic mixture and carried it across the region in massive dust storms. These were not ordinary sandstorms. The dust that blew off the Aral Sea Desert was laced with sodium chloride, sulfates, pesticide residue, and heavy metals. Scientists detected traces of it as far away as the Arctic, the Himalayas, and the forests of Norway. But the people who suffered most were the ones living closest, the ones who breathed that dust every single day. The health consequences were catastrophic and well documented. In the Karakalpakstan region of Uzbekistan, which borders the former southern shoreline, rates of throat cancer climbed to 25 times the global average. Liver cancer rates were 7 times higher than the rest of the world. Tuberculosis, typhoid, and kidney disease spread through communities that had already been devastated by poverty and unemployment. The children suffered the most. Infant mortality in the Karakalpakstan region reached 60 deaths per every 1,000 live births, a rate that was, at the time, the highest recorded anywhere in the former Soviet Union. Doctors and health workers in the region began warning mothers not to breastfeed their newborns because the breast milk itself was found to be contaminated with toxins absorbed from the poisoned environment. A mother's instinct to nourish her child had been turned into a danger by the choices of men who had never visited this region and never would. Anemia became so widespread that studies found more than 70% of children in Muinak were affected. The combination of contaminated water, toxic air, collapsed economy, and broken infrastructure created a humanitarian crisis that the outside world largely ignored for decades. The Aral Sea did not just disappear. It poisoned the land, the air, and the people as it went. Stand in Muinak today, and you will see the ships, rusted, broken, half buried in sand that was once the floor of a sea. They are not monuments anyone built. They are what happens when a civilization makes a decision and walks away from the consequences. The Aral Sea did not die because of a drought. It did not die because of climate change. It did not die because of any force of nature. It died because a group of men in Moscow decided that cotton was more valuable than a sea. They ran the numbers, they drew the plans, they signed the documents, and they moved on. The sea was written off before it even began to shrink, and the people of Muinak, the fishermen, the cannery workers, the children playing on the beach, they had no vote, no voice, no warning. They simply woke up one decade to find the water a little further away, and then further still, and then gone. That is the true weight of this story. It does not take a bomb to erase a sea. It does not take a war. It takes a decision. One decision made in a room far away by people who will never breathe the dust, never drink the poisoned water, never watch their children suffer in a land that was once full of life. The Aral Sea is gone. Most of it will never come back. And the 3.5 million people who live in its shadow are still paying the price for a choice that was never theirs to make. History has a way of recording disasters in numbers and dates. But behind every number here, there is a fisherman who lost his livelihood. Behind every date, there is a mother who was told not to feed her own child. Behind every statistic, there is an entire world that was taken from people who did nothing to deserve it. Remember the ships in the desert, because they are not just a photograph. They are a warning.